dynamics of a narcissistic family. My name is Jared Mello, and this is Black Sheep's Time to Shine, a place where all the different kinds of black sheep can come together, judgment-free. Make sure you stay tuned to the end of this, where I discuss the origins of the expression, bite the bullet. Now, jumping right in, let's start with the parents in these kinds of scenarios. Often there's a narcissistic parent, and then a more codependent parent or borderline parent. Occasionally there will be two narcissistic parents, but more often there's a narcissistic one, and then a more codependent one or borderline one. Now, the people that gravitate towards narcissistic partners are often recreating a relationship they had with one of their parents, and that's how this cycle keeps on going. So a narcissistic parent, they might struggle with alcohol abuse or addiction issues, but not always. But the narcissistic parent has very clear ideals on what they think is appropriate. Often, they're very image-oriented, they're very superficial, and they judge their children very harshly. So if someone gains weight, the narcissistic parent will be the first one to say something about it. And they have narcissistic fantasies about how they want their children to be. And we're going to talk later on about how that portrays itself. But the narcissistic parent will also have opinions about things, and then at the end of their opinion will say, right? Like, this is how it should be, right? And what's going on here is there's the right opinion and then the wrong opinion. And the children learn the wrong opinions are not tolerated, and they will probably be guilted and shamed. So the narcissistic parent has their fantasies, and they're very judgmental, and they'll guilt and shame a lot. And in the family dynamic, they teach that negative emotions, or speaking out against what the parent believes, is not going to be tolerated. Negative emotions are not tolerated, and it's more important to pretend to be happy than it is to actually be happy. So it becomes very difficult for the children to develop autonomy, to be their own person, to have boundaries, to say no, because none of those things are acceptable. And if anything, they're guilted, shamed, and gaslit when they do those things. And it can be very uncomfortable for the children. And this is where the walking on eggshells comes into play. There's this tense undercurrent that happens. Now, the codependent parent, they're not completely innocent either, because sometimes they can be a flying monkey for the narcissistic parent. Other times they'll teach their children, hey, we have to hide things from the narcissistic parent to avoid their anger. And this communicates to the children, it's okay to people please. It's okay to try to avoid conflicts and disagreements. Another thing that's not good. So the narcissistic parent and the codependent parent, they come together to form a toxic mesh that is not very pleasant. So again, very image-oriented, very superficial. They have their narcissistic fantasies, and they create a tense undercurrent with their constant guilting and shaming and leading of the witness, I'll call it, when they have their opinions that are right. And they're like, this is how it is, right? You like this person, right? And it's quite obnoxious, really, but I've heard a lot of people that grow up in this kind of dynamic, they're very familiar with that kind of thinking. So what does this baseline, what does it create in their children? So you'll have one of three things happen oftentimes. One, there will be the golden child. The golden child is the one that kind of goes along with the narcissistic parent's fantasy, and they fit more of the ideals. Maybe they're attractive, maybe they're the firstborn, maybe they're in shape. So the narcissistic parent, they think the golden child is their favorite. And a narcissistic parent, they think children are an extension of themselves. So that's why they take any sort of disagreements or autonomy as a personal insult. And this is something I've seen happen a lot. So that's the golden child. The golden child will be heaped with praise, they'll be given lots of love, and they'll also be pedestalized, which can be traumatizing in its own right. Now, the other people, maybe the lost child, for example, And a good example of the lost child is in the movie Stand By Me, where Gordy, his older brother, died, and his older brother, he was the golden child. But Gordy was more of the lost child. And the lost child, they go inward, and sometimes they shut down because whenever they're their own person, they get guilted and shamed. And speaking up isn't acceptable. Disagreeing with a narcissistic parent isn't acceptable. So they learn to kind of keep to themselves, to maybe become a codependent people pleaser, to go along to get along kind of thing. And it's not necessarily good, but that is what they do. And another example would be the person that can become more of a black sheep, the person that rebels in the scenario, the person that just does the opposite of everything they're told. So the person that rebels, or the codependent person, they might find themselves really enjoying the end of the day when the narcissistic parent has gone to bed, because it's finally a time where that person can be themselves. They don't have that overbearing parent down their throats 24/7 anymore, so they can relax and feel okay. I know that's kind of how it was for me. I loved it when they were all in bed so I could finally relax. The tense undercurrent was gone, and I was finally able just to kind of be me without judgment. So these are the dynamics that happen in these kinds of scenarios. Now, something else interesting can happen to the golden child. If the golden child were to unsubscribe a little bit from the narcissistic parent's reality and do their own thing that doesn't meet the narcissistic parent's fantasy, the golden child can become the scapegoat. And what happened here is the golden child is no longer living up to the narcissistic parent's ideal, and they're doing their own thing, and they can be shuffled. So when the golden child is the golden child, the narcissistic parent might talk to the golden child like, why can't your siblings be more like you? It'll kind of pin siblings against each other, subconsciously perhaps as well. But if a golden child develops their autonomy and it's not to the narcissistic parent's liking, becoming a scapegoat is what they'll be. And this is actually one of the causes of borderline personality disorder, because when the brain is still developing and a primary caregiver switches up on you like that and basically splits, it can be one of the causes of BPD. Now, that's not the only cause of BPD, of course, but it's one of them. The other causes of BPD are often trauma and genetics. It runs in the family. So it's a painful thing when the scapegoat becomes, when the golden child becomes the scapegoat. Now, sometimes if that switch up doesn't happen, the golden child can become the narcissist sometimes, but not always. I've seen it go both ways in that regard. But some of the most malignant narcissists I've ever met, they were the golden child, and they were pampered, and they were pedestalized, and that's how they developed their entitled attitude. And that entitled attitude, being on the pedestal, can be traumatizing in itself, because all of these issues, whether it's BPD, NPD, CPTSD, all trauma-based. Trauma is at the core of a lot of this stuff. Now, what happens to the codependent? What happens to the lost children, the people that become codependent people pleasers or rebel? Often they struggle with anxiety growing up because they're not used to being themselves and having autonomy. They say having a narcissistic parent is a major contributor to a lot of anxiety disorders later in life. So it's not very pleasant. But what are the solutions? So unfortunately, a lot of them gravitate towards, like I said, anxiety, depression, addiction issues, and it's not very pleasant. And then they'll often gravitate towards a narcissistic parent themselves, or a narcissistic partner themselves, and the cycle can continue, which is not good. But how do we break the cycle, more importantly here? And I'll probably make a whole new video about this too. But to break the cycle, unsubscribing from the narcissistic parent's reality will be humongous. That's number one. Number two, probably developing some space, because it's very difficult to develop autonomy and be your own person when you're still right under them, when you're still in their orbit. So some space will be good, finding a way to get the heck out of there when you can. And then once you get out of there, the problems aren't over, because unless they're bad enough to cut off completely, you're still going to have to deal with them. And I think what is bad enough to cut someone off completely would be if you're consistently having your boundaries broken, if they're constantly guilting, shaming you, gaslighting you, abusing you. There is no reason for that. Now, not all narcissistic parents will be that severe. Some may be tolerable. Some may be so that, okay, least amount of contact, not too much contact, small doses, that's fine too. But once we have our space, solid boundaries, clear boundaries, and or gray rock, right? Like once we feel like they're taking from us and our energy is being depleted, then it's time to probably get the heck out of there. Now, in cases where the narcissistic parent is more abusive, I would say there's no reason to be there, unless you absolutely have to be for some sort of reason. But if they're going to be abusive, constantly disrespect boundaries, there's no reason to put yourself through that. And yeah, it's a parent, and yeah, that can be a crappy situation, but we have to learn to put ourselves first, because that was never what was okay growing up, right? It was never okay to put ourselves first. And the narcissistic parent, they would often have their kinds of ideals, like I said in the beginning, and even like the weirdest part about it can be, they would say something like, you should always be helping out others. And like a communal or spiritual narcissist will be this way, where you should always be putting other people before yourself. And this teaches the kids what I think doesn't matter, what I feel doesn't matter. And those are the people that become the codependent people pleasers, because they don't know how to put themselves first in a healthy way. And it's very uncomfortable, but space will be key. Developing a good belief in ourselves, a good mindset, mental models will also be key. And learning how to say no, learning how to have boundaries, and like checking in with ourselves and being honest with ourselves. Like, okay, this person is starting to take from me now. I got to get out of here. Or if it's bad enough, you cut them off completely. But this is a general breakdown here of what happens in a narcissistic family, what happens with the children, etc. And I've seen this pattern play out many, many times. And the cycle repeats, though. The cycle can repeat if someone doesn't develop the self-awareness. The codependent child or the lost child can gravitate towards a narcissistic partner. And the cycle can repeat until someone stops it. Practicing self-respect, radical self-respect, would be humongous in this case, and it could put an end to it. Because I don't want people to think they're a victim here in this too. What we got to do is take a look at our side of the street of it. Whether it's a narcissistic parent or a narcissistic partner, we got to take a look at our side of it and say, okay, what is the most pragmatic way for me to look at this moving forward that will help my life the most? What's going to help me be the happiest and healthiest version of myself? And that's how I want people to look at it. I don't think it's helpful to be the victim of it. I like to think, okay, what can I take from the situation? So in my case, I think, well, I was taught hard work is very important. Looking good is very important. Being in shape is important. And helping others a lot is important. So they're not all bad things on their face. I think I use some of those to my advantage. I just try to be mindful of if I'm taking it too far. If I'm losing myself in the process of doing those things, that's when I try to put a stop to it. And I say, okay, I got to rein it in here a little bit. I'm going too far. But maybe for you, there's other kinds of things you can take from it. And I kind of think that if we like who we are today, we kind of have to have at least a little bit of gratitude for how we became who we are. And I think that really helps in the process of healing. When we like who we are today, when we love who we are today, we recognize that everything that happened to us, everything we've been through, contributed to us becoming who we are today. And for me, that part of the mindset was very helpful too. But again, I want people to own their power, take personal responsibility, and I think that's a great step in going towards the right direction. And in regards to the narcissistic parent, sometimes I suggest cutting them off completely. Sometimes I suggest least amount of contact necessary, or small doses. It really depends on their severity. But I think that's good enough for now on the dynamics of a narcissistic family. But I want to get into now what bite the bullet means and where it came from. So it came from an 1891 novel called The Light That Failed from Rudyard Kipling was his name, and he was from England. And biting the bullet was supposed to mean when there wasn't any anesthetic in an operation or surgical procedure on the battlefield or in a hospital, they would bite a bullet so that they wouldn't feel as much pain, or it would give them a distraction from the pain. Hence the expression, bite the bullet. Now, it's been criticized because it used to be a leather strap that they would bite, but during these procedures, whether it was like an amputation or some other horrific medical procedure, they would bite a bullet to deal with the pain because there was no anesthesia back in that time. So that's the origins of the expression, bite the bullet. But if you've gotten this far, thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you think about this video. Maybe share some of your experiences with a narcissistic family member or parent growing up. I think everyone would like to hear that. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell. And like the video if you liked it. And share this video with others that you think might benefit from it. So with that, thank you very much for watching, and have a great rest of your day.